everyone for joining us today. For those who maybe got on a little bit late and were confused what we were doing, that was just some business for our annual meeting of members. I'm Margaret, the President and CEO of the Executives Club. So this program today is very important. Over the last month, we have all watched, listened to, and participated in very important conversations about systemic racism and how to be effective change makers. With this movement, businesses and organizations around the country are digging in to where and how people of color have been prevented from moving up the corporate ladder. We know that as a meeting point for the members of the Chicagoland business community, the Executives Club must be a space where we can discuss these issues and work to provide resources to make the workplace more equitable and inclusive. For today's program, we have assembled a group of key stakeholders who are creating more diverse, equitable, and inclusive workplaces and communities right here in Chicago. Joining our panel today will be Sabina Gebczyk, Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Ingredion; Wil Lewis, Global Head of Employee Networks, Disability, and LGBT Strategy at Bank of America; Xavier Ramey, Chief Executive Officer of Justice Informed, LLC, and moderating today's conversation is Julie Félix, Assistant Vice President, Diversity and Inclusion at Mesirow Financial. There is a lot to discuss. We want to give our panel ample time to dig in. Just a quick reminder, you can ask questions of the panel, and we really hope you do. They have left enough time for questions. We really want this to be an interactive conversation. Using the Q&A button in the middle of your taskbar. You can also use the chat box, which we will be monitoring, but that's a little trickier. Please try to put it in the Q&A if you can. And then if you have any technical issues, please email programs@executivesclub.org. We'll also put that in the chat for your reference. Our team will be monitoring that if you're having any challenges, and they'll assist you. So thank you for being here today. Without further ado, I'll pass things over to Julie to get us started.
All right, well, thank you so much, Margaret, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to the Executives Club for convening today's timely and relevant conversation on DEI strategies, challenges, and opportunities in the workplace. What type of future do we want to build for ourselves moving forward? That's a question that I hope we have some answers to by the end of today's conversation. And I think really hits at the core at which we find ourselves in this moment in time right now. What type of future do we want to build for ourselves moving forward? By way of background, as Margaret mentioned, my name is Julie Félix, and I lead Mesirow Financial's enterprise-wide diversity and inclusion strategy. And it is my sincere pleasure to be among friends as well as fellow DEI practitioners who I respect very much as leaders in this space, as well as all of you who have graciously decided to join. We hope that by the end of today's discussion, we'll all leave with more ideas and insight on how we as individuals and within our companies might consider additional ways in which to move DEI work forward. So as far as the format is concerned, today's formal panel will be about 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up to Q&A from the audience for the remaining 15 minutes. As Margaret mentioned, you can submit your questions through the Q&A feature. We want to make sure that this session is as impactful as possible. So I'd ask that you please minimize any distractions. If you're not already on mute, then please mute yourselves. And then for an optimal experience, I'd encourage you to switch to the speaker view. And I think as Margaret mentioned, you can adjust your speaker view settings in the upper right-hand corner of Zoom. And then lastly, I just want to mention that we had over 450 people register for today's webinar. So I think without a doubt, that is just another indicator of the fact that individually as well as collectively, we are looking to have these conversations as well as insight and ideas on what other companies are doing to move DEI forward. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. I'd like to ask each of our panelists to briefly introduce yourselves, tell us who you are, and give us an overview of your work. So Xavier, if we could start with you, and then Sabina, and then Wil.
Thank you so much, Julie, and thank you to the Executives Club of Chicago for having me. My name is Xavier Ramey. I'm Chief Executive Officer of a social impact consulting firm called Justice Informed. We're based here in Chicago. We work around 4 strategic areas. One of them is diversity, equity, inclusion. We do everything from organizational equity audits down to training, to executive coaching and other types of activities. We work with public policy informed corporate social responsibility, as well as for foundations, corporate and nonprofit foundations. We work with them to organize new strategies to understand how different types of equity can fit within their grant making or community engagement work. And then we work with a ton of nonprofits, primarily around strategic planning, getting them to understand how they can embed equity, not just in what they talk about, but how they actually look at their operations, their workforce, et cetera.
Sabina, if you'd like to go next.
Sure, thank you, Julie. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sabina Gebczyk. My pronouns are she, her, and I lead diversity, equity, and inclusion DEI and Ingredion. So for me, DEI is a little bit more than a job. For me, it's really a true personal calling. I was born in communistic Poland, and growing up, I grew up in a very closed white bubble. So growing up, I was surrounded by white people that were mostly Catholic. That also my family was, dealing with the trauma of World War II and what happened. So as Poland became democratic in 1990s and we started to open up, it was very interesting to learn about the outside world and really learning about the US as a place, and it was portrayed as a place that has already reached equality for all. So when I came to the US at 18, I have quickly realized the power that I have and the privilege that I have because of the color of my skin. And on the flip side, it was also very interesting because for a couple of years, I was undocumented. So having the experience of an undocumented immigrant in the US, it really changes you. It changes your life perspective, and it changes you at the core. My background is mostly in social justice and social work. I have worked with Burmese refugees on the Thai-Burmese border. I have also worked with homeless people on the west and south side of Chicago. I have worked as an addiction counselor. I have also worked with the victims of domestic violence. So the way I approach corporate DEI is not only from the good for business side, but I also look at it as from a social justice perspective. Go ahead, Will.
Oh, thanks so much. So thank you so much, first of all, Julie, and to the Executive Club for having us here today for a really important discussion around DEI. I'm a Senior Vice President and Diversity and Inclusion Executive at Bank of America. And for me, this topic is particularly important, not only as a native Chicagoan, but of late, there's been many things that we've all been seeing in the news and really spotlighting some of the systemic issues that are at play today. These are issues that I've lived through that are personal to me, but are also very personal to many others. One of the things that I think is really exciting about the work that I can do now, and really more than also very important, I think, to us as leaders, whether you're a DEI leader, diversity, equity, and inclusion leader, or if you are a business leader inside of one of these organizations, is to seize this as an opportunity to learn about something that you may not have been exposed before. Not that you didn't care, you may not have been aware of it before. So I'm looking forward to having an honest and open dialogue today, not only about some of the things that we're doing here at Bank of America, but then how can we together as business leaders and professionals really move the bar and improve and remove some of the systemic inequalities that exist today.
All right, well, thank you so much, Will and Sabina and Xavier, and it's without a doubt, given what all of them have just shared, there's no question why I hold each of you in extreme regard for the work that you do, and I'm glad to be a fellow DEI practitioner among you. So let's dive into the questions. So do you think this moment of attention to racial issues is different? Why or why not? And what in your experience leads you to your viewpoint? Will, if you want to start off, and then Sabina, and then Xavier.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Julie. I think it is different. And the reason I think it's different is not because some of these issues are new. And as a matter of fact, many folks, as I mentioned, live through it and experience it every day. What's really different about what's occurring right now is that there's a greater awareness. Because of the spotlight that's being shined on it, there are people who may not have been exposed before, people that are in power and have an opportunity to help drive change. Not only change inside of their organization, but systemic change throughout our nation and hopefully throughout the world as well. Right here in Chicago, we see every day on the news, and we watch what happens, some of the things that are really impacting our minority communities. I think what's really different and what's key right now is with this spotlight that's shined, it's an opportunity for us as individuals and us as business leaders to raise our hand and say, here's how we're going to engage. And what's really heartening is that I do see many organizations that are saying there's more that I can do. I want to do more to help drive and make an impact on historically communities that have been historically treated unequally.
Yeah, to build up on Will's point, I definitely think it's different. We have seen Black people being brutalized and killed by the police for years, but we have never seen the corporate response we are seeing right now. 6 years ago when Laquan McDonald was shot and killed here in Chicago, we didn't see that 6 years ago when Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson and the uprising that followed. We didn't see that corporate response. But I feel like corporate America is realizing now that the issue of systemic racism that is out, that is not the thing that is just out there, that is outside of the four walls of the corporate America. This is really something that is embedded in the institutional structures. And I think for the last couple of years, we have seen this movement within corporate America really looking at how they can use their business as a force of good. They really are paying attention to, the space they take up in the world. They're paying attention to what are they doing to the communities that they are present in. And there's also more pressure. There's pressure nowadays from community activists. There's also pressure from investor customers for the corporation to use their economic powers to really address injustices. And I also feel within white America is finally realizing that the system that we have been operating in is not equal. The state is here to protect life. In the last couple of months with COVID-19 and the last couple of weeks with all the tragic events that has been happening due to the systemic racism, we are realizing that not every life is equally protected. And also what's amazing to see for somebody who, also came from Europe is that globally people are realizing that this is not just a US issue, that systemic racism is present everywhere and people are really demanding change. So, corporate America has made its strongest statements yet. And I have never seen this urgency that we see right now. My real hope is that, as professional and leaders within the companies, that we can keep that momentum going and you can truly see it change.
Julie, I think this is definitely a different time. My rear view window goes pretty far on this issue. I've been working in the social impact space deliberately for the last almost 11 years, and I've been working and speaking out about racial injustice for nearly the last 2 decades. 6 years ago, when I was in Ferguson and we were marching, there was not the level of support for the 3 words, Black Lives Matter. In fact, many of the companies were shouting against us. Their employees were saying that we were blocking traffic, and that was actually disadvantageous to our call for justice. When we spoke out, when FM Supreme went on CNN, a young woman from Chicago, and she said the words that lit the internet on fire. She said, abolish the police. And she was, just obliterated by people on the left, the right, the middle, you name it. There was absolutely no support for the consideration of how should we look at public safety in the face of our only opportunity and our only avenue of resource goes only to militarized policing. There was no appetite for it. And many of us took incredible risks professionally and personally that we thought we would not see this day today. And so now we have a world where just having a conversation that perhaps Black people shouldn't be brutalized and dragged through a court system that is too expensive for them to fight back honestly and justly in is one that we should examine. How does that then reflect on what African Americans and other people of color who sit and live within America bring into the workforce and bring into the workplace by default because of that. How does that affect their needs for healthcare? How does that affect the conversations at the water cooler? How does that affect their desire to casually talk about systemic racism with their white peers who are just coming around because they just picked up the book White Fragility, right? That we're finally starting to have that conversation. And one of the challenges with all of justice work, as I've come to understand it, is unfortunately, it moves at the pace of fragility of those who already have power. You know, for slavery to be abolished, it took those who were not slaves to vote against slavery. For women to have the right to vote, it took men to vote for the right for women to vote. And so those who have power are the ones who have to do the work first. And they have to acknowledge that anyone, any human being who is being suppressed is always in a state of active resistance, whether they're at work, at home, or in a jail cell. People resist the binds. And we're finally at a point, specifically in this conversation around African Americans, policing, and institutions, to have an actual conversation that I truly hope, and I'm going to be working my butt off to make sure it happens, we actually turn this system around.
Well, thank you all for sharing. And Xavier, you said something that really struck me. You said it's incumbent upon those in power to ignite the change. And I really want to focus in on that as a segue into our next question. So kind of staying with this moment, Wil and Sabina, how have your companies responded to provide support and resources to Black employees and expand the conversation around race and racism internally? I think oftentimes the expectation is that those who are oppressed or those who have been impacted by systemic racism should provide the hand-holding or the guidance for those on the opposite end, those that are in power. But I'm curious, and I'd like to know what kind of resources and support your companies have specifically provided to Black employees who are, without question, feeling the most impacted by systemic racism.
Yeah, I'll start, Julie, if it's okay. Oh, yeah, so I'll tell you, as we think about this at Bank of America, it's not only about our employees, but it's also about the communities in which we do business as well. Because the word that each one of us have used so far is systemic. So to be able to make a change, and as an organization that has some influence and has a lot of these people of power that we're talking about, we thought it was really incumbent upon us to do something to try and make systemic change. Our CEO announced several weeks ago, over the next 4 years, $1 billion to help local communities address racial inequality that frankly have been accelerated by the pandemic, in addition to the items that we're talking about with the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and unfortunately many others. These programs are going to be focused very specifically on how do we help communities not only move through the global health crisis, but also how do we create opportunities, whether that's through training, whether that's through home ownership, et cetera. And it's important to mention that's on top of a commitment for $100 million in philanthropic support that we'd already given, and our normal annual commitment of $250 million to support critical needs. But let me not just say dollar figures, right? Because dollars sound great, and we're really proud of that as well. But what's really important to us is that we're doing work that actually fundamentally focuses on some of the systemic issues and concerns and really addresses the community. So I want to boil that down to what it means for us here in Chicago. So for us here in Chicago, just in the past couple of months, Bank of America has distributed more than $679 million through the Payroll Protection Program, commonly known as PPP. Separately, we've donated $22.5 million to the Neighborhood Opportunity Fund, which supports commercial construction across Chicago's South, Southwest, and West sides. You see, really, what we're saying here is, let's go right to the communities that need the most support and help, not just give money, but over the course of years, what can we do to help housing? How can we support hunger? What can we do to help support small businesses? And what can we do to increase training programs and platforms so then for generations to come, there is ongoing change and support, as opposed to just money now and then we move on. that's not going to get us to where we need to get to as a society. We really do need to focus on now and then also long term. A lot of this has really opened up awareness because of the murders, but also because of COVID. We can't forget about the health crisis that's in play in America right now, while all of this is going on as well. And that's really where our focus is, because for our employees internally, they live in the communities in which we're talking about. They have family members, and in some cases, they themselves. We want to be sure to support them as we look at this, and the communities in which we all live.
Sure. So for us at Ingredion, I think, we have taken more internal approach at the beginning, and it happened really organically because we have been working on amplifying Brown and Black belonging since the fall of 2019. We have conducted racial equity in the workplace, race and racial and gender bias discussions around COVID-19 and how it affected Brown communities and Black communities. We have also discussed xenophobia and racism against Asian American community due to COVID-19. So when the tragic events of the Memorial Weekend happened, our CEO, Jim Zali, was quick to respond, to send a statement out to our employees to show solidarity with our Black employees, to emphasize our everybody belongs value, and to also be very transparent about the challenges that we still have within our organization when it comes to the Black underrepresentation at the leadership level, and all the work that we still have to do to get us to a better place. We have in the last couple of weeks conducted many meetings with our Black employees. We took time to have a global memorial. We are a global organization, so we took time of our day to really remember all the Black people that have been lost to police brutality, and for our leaders to express express the actions that they're going to take to work for a better organization and for a better world. We are also providing our Black employees with group grieving counseling, making sure that the licensed psychologist that we have, it's a person from the Black community. He has experience with Black trauma and grief and healing. On the flip side, we have also made sure that we provide resources to our non-Black employees. So we have created a library where there are resources around white fragility, white privilege, color blindness, because we wanted to ensure that we don't put more emotional labor on our Black employees. We also provided managers with tools so they can, especially the managers who supervise Black employees, with tools so they can support their employees through this very difficult time. So we've been doing a lot of internally, and then right now we also are adding a couple of actions because our diversity and inclusion strategy was already so based of the issue of underrepresentation and the issue of belonging, development, all of that. So we are adding a couple more actions into our DEI strategy. And now we are really focusing externally. So the organization that we can support, especially in STEM, looking at, our engineers who we hired.
Well, thank you guys. Oh, sorry, did somebody want to add? Okay. Thank you, Wil and Sabina, for responding. And I think that both of you did a really great job in highlighting your internal efforts as well as the external community impact piece that you brought up, Wil. I know at Mesirow Financial, that's certainly been a part of our conversation. Beyond the financial donations that we make, we really want to invest in smaller businesses as well as the communities that are most affected right now. We do have a question from the audience, but before we get to that, I'd like to go back to you, Sabina. So obviously there's covert and there's overt racism. We have Ahmaud Arbery, we have Breonna Taylor, we have the murder of George Floyd, and then we have the Amy Coopers of the world in Central Park. Mm-hmm. So what would you say to folks who say that they're not racist or they don't see color? In your opinion, what's the best way to navigate that conversation professionally?
Yes, Julie, thank you for this question. It's a very interesting question because for the person that is making those statements, it will always be a personal issue. But I think, approaching this in a professional setting, the best way to do it will be really to tie it back to the values and the purpose of the organization. So for example, for us, our purpose is to make life better. One of our values that is leading our DEI initiative is everybody belongs. In order for us to really know what is standing in the way of everybody belonging, we need to learn about people experience. The first thing I think when somebody says, you know, I'm not racist, is provide them with the understanding that there is a difference between interpersonal racism and then institutional and structural racism. Because white people tend to get very, very defensive when they hear that word, because they associate this, and they have been taught to associate this with the interpersonal part. It's like part of identity, and you don't want to be associated with, you know, in a way that's nasty identity. So really explaining to them that this is something bigger, that we are operating in a system that is racist, that our processes and policies everywhere in every institution are based on that system. When it comes to, you know, being colorblind and colorblindness, that is a very problematic ideology, because we know that people are being deprived of opportunities, denied access to wealth, education, healthcare. People are brutalized and people are killed by the police. And there's this notion on color blindness that relies on this concept that race-based differences don't matter. And that ignores the reality of systematic racism. So we are in a way denying people of color, especially Black people, their lived experience. And it's a white privilege to be able to say I'm colorblind, because for us white people, we have the privilege to walk away from color. Black people and people of color don't have that privilege. That is their identity. So I think important thing at the professional level is really to allow for this conversation within, allow and encourage this conversation in a professional setting, because you normalize it. Then people have a chance, even in a group setting, to, you know, exchange experience. And, you know, working and talking about race and color is always going to be uncomfortable. So you have to build this muscle. And I think at Ingredion for us, we always keep saying, you know, we have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And in the words of Melody Napson, we have to be color brave. We have to just build the muscle and talk about it.
I love Melody Hobson's YouTube video on color braveness. In case you haven't seen it, I would highly encourage you to watch it. And thanks for your feedback, Sabina, on ways that we can engage those conversations professionally. I know personally, this has also been part of my own experience. I am biracial, my mom is white, my dad is Black, and many of my white family members have said, you know, well, I don't see you as being any different. I just see you as being a member of the family, and I don't see the fact that you're Black. And while I appreciate where that sentiment is coming from, it really fails to recognize the very real experiences that I have as a Black woman in this country. One example of that, and I'm not going to go off too far, but you know, I grew up in Deerfield. One evening I was followed home by 5 undercover police officers because I looked like I didn't belong in that neighborhood. That is an experience I'm sure that none of them will ever have. And so we've recently as a family also gotten into some more intentional conversations around race. And I think that's also the really, maybe the difference of this moment as well. I've seen a lot of non-Blacks, so Hispanic, Asians, really also taking up the mantle and wanting to have those conversations about race within their immediate families, within their circles of influence. And so I think that's another way in which this moment is really, really different. So thanks again, Sabina. So now, Xavier, moving back to you and kind of bringing it back home to Chicago. In your TED Talk, you talk about how Chicago is the fastest growing segregated city in the country. And segregation is just one example of how structural racism can create challenges for DEI strategies. So can you unpack this for us a little bit? And in your opinion, how do DEI leaders engage ongoing societal issues that are examples of structural racism to increase their DE&I impact?
Thanks for that question, Julie. First, I would encourage anyone who's interested in diversity, equity, inclusion, anyone who's leading that work, and then anyone who's leading a company that purports to be about it, to step back and consider what it means to grow your understanding of sociological trends. There's sufficient data out there to stop a lot of the arguments that people are using to stall progress or to slow it down. And it's when you look at the DEI issues inside an organization and understand that every organization sits within a community, and every community sits within a country. And there are specific challenges that are endemic to those companies that come from those communities they're in, and that come from the way in which the country operates itself. So even whether you're local to Chicago or you're global, you have to always keep your tabs on what's happening and what are the data scientists saying, and what does that have to do with you in your organization. In the city of Chicago, Chicago's a growing city. It's the third largest city here in the US. It's a bustling metropolis. We have tons of new types of business. If you look at World Business Chicago, you'll know that we have a fairly diversified workforce. We also have a fairly diversified business core. There's no one single type of business that owns the entire city. So it's not like a manufacturing town or, a university town. So our economic foundation is fairly stable. When you look at who's able to reap the benefits of that, however, it tends to mostly be people who are white. And when you look at the question of what happens in the corporate space, when we have companies that are spending, for instance, in this conversation, we're talking about primarily corporate diversity, equity, inclusion. We have companies that set up full teams or groups of individuals. They have committees, they have ERGs or BRGs, they put millions of dollars to it, like Will is talking about. They develop all these, very, very elaborate strategies to push it forward. But then their workforce takes their wages and they go home and self-segregate the city. Your employees take that money and they go into a specifically white neighborhood. The West Loop of Chicago was built in the 21st century. Anyone who's over the age of 20, we built a nearly fully segregated community on your watch. Is it possible to not build it that way? Absolutely. Did we do otherwise? Absolutely not. There are many reasons for that. You can, if you look at the data and you understand that, when you look at wages and you look at people of color, African Americans, no matter the wages that they receive, they tend to still remain in low to moderate income communities. Many of them have a feeling of wanting to still be close, wanting to give back, to use their influence, to use their dollars to directly impact what they felt they may have had to escape. When you look at the wages that many of our white counterparts receive, they don't integrate into communities. They don't. And that's a hard pill to swallow for a lot of people. But when you look at a lot of the Pew studies and the Gallup polls and all these things, everyone says they want diversity. But when it comes down to how they spend their dollar, they self-segregate themselves. And that creates an effect on a city, partly because you're talking about social networks. So you have many companies where jobs are gotten not just by some blind recruitment strategy. They're gotten through networks, particularly at the executive level. Hiring often happens through relationship. And when that is the case, if you work for a company where your CEO, if you look at his Facebook page, you look at his LinkedIn page, you look at the types of people, or he or she or they play with, work with, etc., and you don't see a sufficient level of diversity, they are not actually capable. They're not capable of driving those types of results for your company. Their social network is not diversified enough. Secondly, the ability to be comfortable about this work and these conversations requires that you have them very often. Frequency creates comfort. And so when you have executives who are not comfortable about talking about something like managing interpersonal conflict across differences of race or gender or otherwise, that lack of comfort often comes from the very homogeneity that I'm talking about right now. They're showing that they have not had the life experiences, though they have the executive responsibilities. There's no school for that. I talk to a lot of schools, Stanford, UChicago, Northwestern, etc. I've been talking with all of them about how are they training people? How is their curriculum being grown so that we're not producing the same type of person out of their business schools? So that these types of people actually understand the nuanced responsibilities and challenges that only exist across interpersonal conflict issues, not across business bottom line issues, not across marketing challenges. It's about the fact that I don't know you and we are in the same workplace and one of us has power over the other person. And that can affect our entire city and it affects our entire country. And that's where we get these wealth disparities and wage disparities. When it comes to banks, right? The report that just came out, For every dollar that's been invested by banks and mortgages in Chicago into white households, 12 cents went to Black households. For every dollar invested in white households, 12 cents went to African Americans. There's one neighborhood in Chicago, it's over 95% white. That entire zip code got more residential lending than the entire south and west side of the city. When you have that singularity in investment, what you're saying is the dreams and the opportunities and the expectations of these types of people are worth investing in. As an entrepreneur, I know the same thing. When you look at the global wealth management, 97% of all dollars under management right now are managed by white men. That's $97 trillion. That's a lot of money across the earth, and it's mostly managed by white men. When you look at the question of funding, you want to create more businesses, more people of color creating small businesses. Well, the reality is the vast majority, all but 9 cents of every dollar that's invested in entrepreneurs writ large goes only to white men. When you invest in an entrepreneur, you're saying that the dream they have for the world is the world we need to live in. So what you're saying in that racialization of your expenditures is that only the dreams of white men are the ones that we should have for our world. And that has an effect. If your DEI strategy doesn't get that deep, it's not deep enough. If George Floyd is killed and your African-American employees are not only stressed out, they are traumatized. You have an FMLA strategy, but you don't know how to talk to the Black mothers who have Black sons, who they are now very, very worried about and have always been worried about. If your BRGs aren't engaging that, it's not strong enough for the 21st century. If it still holds the fragilities of the one guy who's like, well, I don't think that this should be about race because poverty trumps race, it's not strong enough. It's not strong enough. And it leads to this further segregation because there's very little accountability for where we choose to live, even if we hold our companies responsible for how diverse our workplace is. And that has grave societal effects.
You know, Julie, I know you want to get to Q&A here as well for the members, but I'm certain that there are some folks out there picking up on what Xavier and Sabina were talking about that are thinking, what do I do, right? I'm leading an organization, I'm leading a not-for-profit, I'm leading a company. Tell me very tactically what I do. And I think here is where the members that are listening right now have an opportunity to make an impact because they are in a position of power. And it starts off with recognizing that everyone's in a different place in the spectrum. Even those of us at Bank of America, we're proud of what we've done. We recognize we have a lot more to do, but we also realize that every other organization is a different beginning, middle, further down the maturity cycle of this. Very specifically, a few tactics that folks should really think about doing this is if you decide to bring a DEI professional inside of your organization, or you have one that's already in your organization, whomever is leading that organization, put them in a position of authority and influence. Make them high enough in the organization, bring them as close as possible to the CEO, the chief HR officer, have them report into a place where they're viewed in the company as an authority and where they have access to the power center of the company, whatever that means for your company. If you already have a DEI professional in your company, don't shrug your shoulders and say, all right, I've done my part. No. Go back and take a look and say, where do I have this person reporting? Are they in a position of influence? And have I resourced their organization, their group to be able to get the job done? Think about it if you were trying to drive a new sales initiative and roll it out to dramatically increase your revenues, because essentially we're talking about a role that impacts the people that work for you or likely the communities in which you sell or do your business in. How would you resource that sales organization? And then look at how you resource your DEI organization and be honest with yourself and decide if you need to make changes or do something differently. I'm talking to the folks that are leading organizations. And then the other thing that I would say to really think about is normalize this conversation inside your organizations. Make it safe for folks to come in and acknowledge the fact that they're Black or that they're not white, and engage in a conversation around that. And also think about what you're doing around benefits to be able to support those individuals. We're walking in the doors with baggage, the baggage from home, the baggage from our community, the baggage from the health crisis, the baggage from watching these murders that we've all watched on TV, that they impact those of us that are Black, but they impact your entire organization. We all watch the video or the videos of what's been occurring. Think about how you're supporting your employees through that mental health challenge and create an environment that's safe for them to seek help, provide help, and normalize it in your organization. And then be honest with what your opportunities are openly and publicly in your organization. Create a space where they can have conversations that are courageous in nature, for them to be able to engage one another. And it doesn't always have to be top down, but instead from all sides. Those are 4 or 5 very specific tactics, if you're thinking through this, that you can take right now as a leader of an organization.
Yeah, I want to also touch, Julie, on leadership and how leadership can actually push DEI, because I think that's really important. Like, one of the things we, Will and Xavier and I are talking about is really leaning into the courage. But also from the other perspective is, many organization institutions are still operating as hierarchies. So leaders sometimes underestimate the power that they have coming from the top down. And when you push something top down, it's more respected than, the momentum from the bottom. And yes, Will is right, it has to come from all the sides, but sometimes in some instances, it's more powerful when it's really coming from the top. So what we have done with Ingredion, we have completed a maturity model in 2019, because we really wanted to know where are we in a DEI journey and where are we going to go from that time. And one of the biggest things with us was DEI is owned by our leaders. So really the leaders taking the ownership of DEI, talking about it like it's another business strategy, is not something on the side. Our leaders are taking it and embedding it to all their functions that they're leading, being transparent about their metrics and being accountable for their metrics. So we do have goals around right representation, but for the longest time, we didn't know what our starting point is. We have BRG's leader, everybody working on these goals. So we really need to become transparent about the metrics that we have in the organization and think about them the same way we report on safety, the same way we report on finance and all the other things. And being inclusive leaders too. So having these courageous conversations, this is required of a leader in the 21st century. It's really, they need to, in the words of Brené Brown, they really need to dare to lead. They have to lean in to this discomfort. And then, so when people in the organization see that the leaders take the ownership of DEI personally, they're gonna follow. So I'm lucky in the way because my CEO and my CHRO are champions. They're standing behind DEI, they're leading DEI. Also our ELT team, they are taking personal ownership. I have seen them lean into discomfort so much in the last couple of weeks, standing with our Black community, not knowing what to say, but standing in it. So for the entire organization now, seeing that the leaders are taking the personal ownership of it and leading with it, it's a huge, a push in our DEI strategy. I think, so what I'm just trying to say, I think, it is for the leaders to look at the power they're holding and not underestimate the power that they have.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Xavier.
One thing I just want to say, so one of the things that, when we think about streams of work and the question of how to start, at Just Informed, we think about it in 3 different areas. One is work that builds understanding. The challenge of building understanding is that it is good work and it is also insufficient work. These are things similar to like coaching and training and these sorts of things that many people start off with. But I think about this work very much like kind of like the medical field, right? Some of our clients, they are in the ER, right? They're like front page of the newspaper. They got litigation issues. Their workforce is ready to walk out. They're in the ER. There's a certain temperament that whoever's managing DEI has to have for that type of a patient. There are folks who are in preventative care who don't really have any urgent issues, but they also don't know what could possibly go wrong. And so they're looking for best practices. They're looking for the question of what are the guardrails that we should be establishing over different areas of our company? And how do we ensure that we're tracking that in such a way that we know where the red flags are when something is about to drop and hurt us? You got some folks who are in the operating room, right there. That's where that's easiest for a firm like Just Informed because they know exactly what's wrong. Or we've already gone through an equity audit and we know what's wrong. And we can be surgical about those types of issues that they have and stabilize those areas. But the one thing that I find is always difficult for any company is not about the work ahead. It's repairing the work in the past that wasn't done. Princeton over the last couple days is having a lot of issues right now. They're a major, major institution, but they're acting as if they didn't actively protest against Black Lives Matter 5 years ago. The University of Chicago is another one. I used to work there as a head of social innovation. You have these institutions that specifically did not come out for Black Lives Matter, did not come out for their Black employees, did not come out for people of color, did not speak out against these types of things that were affecting their workforce. And now their DEI strategies are incomplete because they don't include the important work of acknowledgement. They don't include it. They just want to focus on what's going forward. And all DEI work is about a form of creating and sustaining manageable and accountable relationships. How can you create a relationship when one person has been abused and the other is the abuser, and the abuse is never acknowledged? And I know this because I do a lot of training and I do a lot of coaching, that a lot of people, you can build the best DEI strategy you want on paper. Your employees are still upset about what you didn't say or do 3 years ago. They are. And unless you step into that space of conscientious conversation, moving from acknowledgement to solidarity to accountability, and accountability taking both roads of, one, we're restoring the harm that's been done, but we're also creating infrastructure to prevent the probability of future harm, then it's incomplete. And I think that I just want to make sure that folks don't think that this is just about the road ahead. You have to repair what wasn't done, because those relationships will create resentment, and that resentment will turn into attrition. And that resentment will also turn into reputational hazards down the line. It will lead to blocks on projects you try to build because your project teams don't have trust. And so I want to challenge everyone who's listening right now. Don't just think about what you're going to do from today on, or what you've been doing since George Floyd was killed on the 25th of May. Think about it from a real lens of, if we're honest about where we didn't show up, what do we need to restore, not just build? What must we restore? Because you're talking about people in your firms. And that's a relationship you have to manage.
This conversation is so amazing. I like my brain is going on 100. But I think, Xavier, what you were at the heart of what you just said is really the idea around transparency. And any kind of holistic DEI strategy has to involve that reflection on the past, and an acknowledgement of maybe ways in which your company did not fully embrace a moment or fully act in a moment, as well as how do we want to change and how do we want to be better going forward. So one term that's been thrown around a lot today, which is kind of a newer term in terms of D and I, is the E, equity. So this next question, Xavier, is directed at you as well. And oftentimes equality and equity are used interchangeably, but really they're two very different terms. So could you please describe for us what the difference is and why it's so important for equity to be considered when organizations are implementing strategies?
Yeah, first I'll just say that equality is about process and protocols. Equity is about the creation of a sustainable and accountable relationship. So I want to bring that word back in, relationship, 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 relationship. Equity is about restoring and creating accountable relationships. Accountability is about the directionality of power. Oftentimes, particularly in corporate firms where you have more of a top-down structure, power is unidirectional. People like to think that there's a transparent and diversified power model for decision makings, et cetera. But the reality is there's still an org chart, and that has an effect. And when you look at this question of equality, what it requires you when you don't look at equity, just equality, it requires that you're always dealing with an issue from the day you're looking at it. So for instance, where harm is done, many times people would say we shouldn't go back and restore harm. So if you talk about something like this, is bringing up the big S word or E word, enslavement. African Americans specifically were enslaved. Reconstruction was torn down as a process in our historical past here in America after less than 15 years. After the Civil War, there were roughly 11 years where African Americans were allowed to rebuild, start to try to run for Congress and build businesses and all these sorts of things before Jim Crow was enacted. All the way up until mass incarceration, all the way up until now, we're talking about DEI. You can't have equality. It's not going to happen. Because if we come up with, for instance, if we come up with an idea and we say, well, we want every you know, like a HR policy, right? We want every employee to have, you know, 10 days of PTO, right? 10 days of PTO, and that's what we want. We want to make sure that, you know, it's generous. Maybe we'll say 40 days, let's say, because that's actually generous. 40 days of paid time off. And you look at something like that and you say, well, what will it be utilized for? If it's for someone like me, my past employer, I remember having conversations with people who were trying to hire me for director level jobs. And I was telling them, hey, I still mentor young men on the west side of Chicago. My life is connected to them. I know that I'm a role model to them. I also grew up on the west side of Chicago in a low income neighborhood called North Lawndale. And I know that in order for me to have a good package here at this organization, I'm gonna need more bereavement days, not just PTO. I need more bereavement days specifically. And I need longer time for that because I bury more people. I'm an African-American living in Chicago. I bury more people. That's real. Look at the headlines. And so how does that fit into an equality model if everybody gets the same thing? When in a segregated city, only some of us are burying our kids. You would have to have a more flexibility around it. And equality does not allow for flexibility. It allows for process and statute. Equity is when you allow for context to come into the conversation and you take a historical approach with an accountable lens to how you're now creating processes and structures. You're now saying the value of your experience is as valuable as your production. And how you experience your life will have an effect on your ability to be productive here at work. And so we take that into account. Now, we also know that it's hard to have a conversation with one person where they're like, well, I get this and they get that. How come they get that? That's reverse racism. And you'll deal with that. And I suggest that you simply have a corporate ethos that explicitly and specifically centers who you're there for and what you're talking about. If you look at the corporate statements that Ben & Jerry's put out, Ben & Jerry's is like famous now for their statements. It is completely clear what they're about. If you don't understand what Ben & Jerry's is talking about as a corporation, you weren't listening. They are very clear about who they're out here for. They're very clear about they don't want to have a conversation about black on black crime because they understand that militarized policing actually produces unsafe communities because of the drain that it has on municipal budgets, and corporate expenditures towards community service programs are never going to replace what government has to produce. And so we have to be super specific about the equity argument versus the equality argument, because specifically only African Americans are experiencing this. And in the same way with immigrants, people who are coming to the country, when the Muslim ban was created, equity would have meant that people had to talk about me. I'm not an immigrant. I don't need to be in that conversation. You don't have to create some special program to include me. It's not reverse immigrationism. You don't need to include me in that. That's for them. They're experiencing that harm. Where harm is specific, the solution must be as well. Equity allows for a specific solution. Equality requires a general solution, and that's why it's ineffective. That's also why it's disrespectful in a relationship to talk about equality where one person has paid significantly more, the other one acts as if they simply didn't see it.
Speechless.
I don't even know what to say. That was just amazing. Will and Sabina, is there anything that you'd like to add to Xavier's comments on equity versus equality?
And I think one thing is, you know, and Xavier also talks about it, really creating a common language with your organization. So for us, we have added, we used to have diversity and inclusion, right? And we realized that we can bring all diversity we want to the company. We're never going to achieve inclusion until we really look at policy and processes that we have and recognize which ones are, you know, creating more inequity within the organization. So really having this common language around that. One other thing that I can think for us, we have recently, you know, created a gender not conforming and transitioning in a workplace policy. And when we were in the process of that, one of the most important things for us was to include the LGBT community. So if you are creating processes and policies within your company, make sure that the people you're creating them for are at the table and have insight and, you know, have say about it, because this is a policy that is going to be for them. So we also making sure, like within Ingredion, if we have, you know, talks about our Black community, that our Black community is in the room. If we have talk about women, women are in the room. So always make sure to include.
Yeah. I think that's a really great point, Sabina. Nothing for us without us, right? And so if you're going to work to create something, do nothing for us without us. I think the other thing, and this is really focused on equality and equity. Equality, in my mind, in addition to some of the comments that were already made, is around when you go out and you just talk to one group and you say, we're going to work to prop you up and do all the things that you need to be able to be on the same level that I'm at. Whereas when you're looking for equity, I think it's an opportunity to really educate and drive on inclusion. So let's educate those others that are not in whatever that group is. If it's Black, if it's LGBT, if it's your disability community, let's go out and not only learn from that group. Listening is a key component part of all of this. You have to go and listen to the items that folks are saying that they are missing, the opportunity that they say they did not have. Understand what was missed out in the past and where your organization may have gone wrong, and then plot a path forward. And not only plot a path forward that involves whatever your target group is as you're driving towards equity, you have to bring everybody along on that journey with you. Be sure that everyone's educated on, hey, we are acknowledging the fact that we have an opportunity here with our Black population, with our Latinx population, with our LGBT population, and so on. And talk broadly to the organization, because part of what's happening now, part of why this movement is so powerful now, bringing us back to where we started, is the fact that everyone is aware. Now, I was always aware of what was going on as a Black man living in Chicago, but right now what's happening is that we all watched the video. I think it's unfortunate that it took a video of someone getting murdered to motivate us. But I think it's an opportunity now that we are all looking at it, and now that we are all aware of the inequities that exist, for us all to come along on that journey. What'll be key over the course of the next year is that we don't, in the next year and years, is that we don't forget that your entire organization, all of us as humans, need to move forward in this together. And I think that one where we began, nothing for us without us, becomes an important path.
Well, I can certainly say from my experience at Mesirow, one of the things that I've learned as the head of D&I has been to involve employees in the strategy. And I think as much as it's important for strategy to be driven from the top down, in terms of what the strategy looks like, that employee engagement piece that you're all talking to is fundamental. You have to involve those who are most affected in the desired outcomes that you'd like to see. So we're kind of running towards the end here. I think that's a really nice transition into one question from the audience, particularly as we have talked about the sense of urgency of companies, people, individuals wanting to do something now. The reality is that this work is going to take a long time. And Wil, I want to commend Bank of America particularly for the way that you've stepped out with your community investments and your long-term commitment to those efforts. So with that in mind, and this question is for everyone, we have major companies now anxious for a quick fix in this new awakening. As business roundtables and ERGs are asked by CEOs on a quick fix on what to do next, many of the HR managers respectfully are not equipped in this area. What recommendations have you seen that are most effective in compelling CEOs to drive change? And that's an open question.
Yeah, I'll start off and then we can all jump in. There is no quick fix. Let's just put a period right there. There is no quick fix. But what there can be is the beginning of a journey that will take time. And so I think it starts with listening. For me, whenever something's going on, I take a moment to listen. So you listen to your ERGs, you listen to your teammates that are not ERGs, and you listen to people that are in the impacted population, as well as those that are not a part of that population. And then as a part of that listening, you then come out and you listen, and then you say, this is what I heard. So you repeat that, and then you say, here is our strategy. And then you involve those folks that we were talking about before as a part of that strategy. And then you hold yourself as a leader of the organization accountable, but you hold everyone at all different levels of management in the organization accountable as well. Because what you can't do, and what you will probably not be successful with, if you say, we hired a DEI professional, let them handle it. No, the accountability actually goes across the entire organization. Put in measurable goals to help you drive forward and achieve that. And know that those goals will have to become institutional or systemic, if you will, for your organization as well. Institutionalize the expectations of the organization. Have the board ensure that they're holding you as a CEO accountable for it. As a CEO, ensure that you are holding senior managers in your organization accountable for it, and have metrics that you're going back and measuring. So every time you talk about business results, you're also talking about your DEI performance. And when you're missing something, don't wash it under the rug. Don't say that's less important. Don't say we have other things. Say, what's our action plan? The same approach you would take if something else were not going as the way you want it to. Ensure that you have very measurable and tangible metrics to do that as well, and then repeat it. It's not a one-time conversation. Just like you do your annual strategy for your organization, you need to come back around to this and measure it as well. There is not a quick fix.
Yeah, and I want to add on that really quickly. Another thing to be very careful about, there's also not one size fits all. And I have seen that happen with many consulting companies coming into the organization thinking that there's one size fits all. And I can tell you for us that, we are a global company. We are in all the regions. We have a corporate, DEI strategy, which is then being disseminated to the regions, and the regions take that strategy and make sure that any kind of regional nuances are being reflected in that strategy. So be very careful when people come and saying, I have this one, best practice that, one size fits all, that is going to fix all your problems around DEI. Be very careful around that.
I would second that thing. I get so many people coming to say that, it's, again, I think about it like the medical field, people coming in and saying, operate, operate, operate. And from a position of just responsibility, imagine telling your doctor, like, cut me open now, boss, cut me open now. I don't know what's wrong. I don't know what you can bear. There's some prehab. Are you aware of the rehab? This is an emergent process. Stepping back, this question of quick fixes, what is HR capable of? What is it not capable of? How do we create accountability, but also empowerment for executives? I like to step back and I think about, what you read really does help, right? I don't read the same stuff that a lot of folks in the business world read. I don't always read Harvard Business Review and Stanford Social Innovation Review and these sorts of things. When you read Revolution and Evolution in the 21st Century, or an Indigenous People's History of the United States, or Emergent Strategies by Adrienne Maree Brown, you get an understanding that there are different ways to create organizations. There are different ways to manage conflict. There's different ways to respond both emotionally and psychologically, but also intellectually and mindfully to the challenges that our organizations present to us. And so when we think about this solely through the lens of disaster management, crisis management, reputational hazard, litigation, etc., we're immediately stepping into a space where we're actually creating an emotional response to something that is systemic. And that's never going to work. I don't think that's the heart set to do this type of stuff. This is heart work. This is heart work. That's what DEI is. It's heart work. And you're playing around with the most violent place of possibility in the world. That's the human heart. And so you have to engage very humbly with that. People have to be invited for you to tell them how they would live. And so when you do that and you say quick fix, you're telling someone change now. You're not realizing you're asking them to supplant all the relationships they've made up to this point. Some people don't want to, they don't see themselves as racist, not because they're actually evaluating their actions, but because they don't know how to go home to the people who haven't even thought about whether they are racist. They don't know how to go home to those people and still love them, still care for them, still understand them. They don't know how to go back to the communities where they built their credibility around a type of culture and a type of activity and a perception about the us versus thems, and still feel like they're a part of that community. And so the DEI work has to be very, very organic and emergent in that way. This is to say, that's deep stuff. There's no quick fixes for that. One of the things that Grace Lee Boggs talks about. She's an author, she's an organizer up in Detroit. She just passed away several years ago. But she's seen as like one of the mothers of the activism work in the 20th century, particularly around worker and labor rights. And she said, we have to remember that this is a commitment to struggle, not solution. This is a commitment to struggle. This is about relationship, meaning that it's not about what you become, it's about committing to the becoming. You don't know how this is going to end, but you have to move urgently and importantly, you have to be gracious with yourself as you step into learning things that you never knew. And for those of us who are facilitators, I tell this to my team all the time, we're asking people to change the way they think life exists. You can't do that with any level of arrogance. You have to hold people as they thrash into learning about the relationships they weren't having that they thought they were having. And so for HR, which is primarily built around litigation, policy, structures, if-then type scenarios, these binaries and linear models, it simply does not work. And this is why I brought up the question of what are you reading?
We've got, just got to close it out, Xavier.
Yeah. If you're only reading the types of stuff that like Harvard produces or Stanford produces or McKinsey produces and these other types of there's a world of activists and organizers and people who are at the grassroots of social development who are brilliant and have developed all types of organizational models and ideas that you're missing out on. And they will tell you what the long road looks like. And that's why we say we should be informed by justice and not other things, because it's not just about the KPI or the bottom line. It's about making sure the relationship can endure these types of changes.
Well, on that note, I want to thank everyone. I think that hopefully those who are on the call today walked away with some deep insights, perhaps some action items to consider as you all move forward in your own DEI strategies. One of the themes that I heard throughout the conversation was 21st century leadership competencies. And so I want to go back to the question that I asked at the beginning. What type of future do we want to build for ourselves moving forward? And I think for the leaders who are on the call today, I would ask that question specifically of you. What type of organizations and companies do you want to build for your employees moving forward? I also want to acknowledge that I think this moment in time requires something different. As many of the panelists have shared, it requires us to push beyond our comfort levels. And if we really truly want to shift and create new paradigms moving forward, then let us all embrace the uncomfortability that it requires. And on that note, I hope you all enjoyed today's conversation. I'd like to thank all of our panelists, and I will turn it back over to Margaret to close us out.
Thank you, Sabina, Will, Xavier, Julie. This is an initial conversation right into what is a journey of work that we have to do to ensure a more equitable and diverse business community, but also world. The questions were fast and furious. I know we could not get to many of them, but I am confident that everyone on this panel, they are the leaders doing this work in the community. Just reach out to them. They are not hard to find. They want to help. So, I know there were some very specific questions, just reach out to them. I want to remind everyone that we also have created a resource page on our website, and we're going to be adding a lot of the things that were discussed on that, so it'll be available to you. And then finally, I want to invite you to continue this conversation. So on Wednesday morning at 8 a.m., we have Tom Alexander, the CEO of Holistic, and Dr. Tanja Coleman, and it's going to be just an office hours, just taking what you heard today, and when you just want to keep talking about it as leaders and thinking through how you want to be navigating these things within your organization so that you can really impact the change that we all say that we want to have. I know we've gone a few minutes over. Thank you all for your patience. Thank you to all of you leaders on this call helping us think through all of this. Have a great day, everybody. Take care.
Thank you all.